For years, Edward Whitmore, one of the most powerful financiers in the country, told the world that his only son had been born with a rare neurological disorder that left him completely silent. Daniel Whitmore had never spoken a single word, not at school, not at home, not even when examined by doctors. The story sounded tragic, and for decades, everyone believed it. But everything changed the day Maya Williams, the family's longtime housemaid, the one person who had shown the boy genuine care, was suddenly and very publicly accused of stealing a confidential medical file. What unfolded next would shake a courtroom to its foundations and eventually the entire nation. For on that day, the boy who had been mute his entire life opened his mouth. He spoke, not out of fear, but to reveal a truth his father had spent years burying. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. And comment below where you are watching from. We always love to know. It was Edward Whitmore himself, standing before a bank of cameras and reporters, who first shaped the story. His voice was measured, his appearance deliberate. He declared that his son, Daniel, had been born with a rare condition that robbed him of hearing and speech. There was hope, he said, an experimental therapy in the United States that might restore Daniel's voice. But there was a problem. The legal fund that could unlock the money for treatment was tied up in court by a missing document. Edward presented himself as a desperate father, not a tycoon. His plea was moving. He insisted it wasn't about money or influence. It was about saving his son. Audiences across the country were touched by the performance. Edward, though weary in appearance, stood firm. Beside him was his attorney, Claudia Reynolds, her sharp suit and sharp eyes signaling control. She assured the press that she was doing everything possible to resolve the legal hold. Behind the cameras, Claudia was relentless. She petitioned judges, filed urgent motions, and placed calls to those in positions of influence. Each day seemed to bring another obstacle. Still, she pressed on, arguing that the research fund, worth millions, existed precisely for children like Daniel. Yet because of disputes over governance, the money remained locked. She told the court that without the document, Daniel's chance at a normal life would slip away. The clock was ticking. News outlets followed her closely. Clips showed her striding into court with files stacked high, conducting late-night interviews, her words passionate and precise. Online, people rallied behind her. Some even called her a hero. But inside the Whitmore estate, behind the tall stone gates and echoing halls, the atmosphere was starkly different. There, Maya Williams moved quietly through the rooms, as she always had. She had served the Whitmores for years, cleaning, preparing meals, and caring for Daniel when Edward traveled. She had watched Daniel carefully. He never cried. He never laughed. He never uttered a sound. He sat in silence, often staring at the floor. At times, when his father entered the room, Daniel's expression hardened, not in love, but in fear. Maya had also overheard the private exchanges between Edward and Claudia. Their voices, usually calm in public, grew low and urgent when the doors were closed. They seemed anxious, even irritable. Something about their tone unsettled her. She began to wonder whether the story told to the world was the complete truth. Still, Edward's campaign pressed forward. He appeared on morning programs, visited hospitals, and met with officials. Always he framed himself as a father seeking only to save his son. The narrative was carefully staged. Daniel was never shown publicly, yet Edward spoke often about him, about how he once smiled as an infant, how his mysterious condition had stolen his joy. But Maya, who spent more hours with Daniel than anyone, saw a different picture. The boy rarely smiled. He avoided his father's presence, relaxing only when Maya was near. Once she overheard Edward shouting over the phone, ordering someone to stick to the plan. Another time, Claudia accidentally left a folder open on the kitchen table. Maya glimpsed its contents, contracts and financial agreements, not medical files. The names and numbers inside bore no relation to Daniel's health. Meanwhile, Claudia pressed harder in court. emphasizing that this wasn't only about one child, but about giving hope to families facing similar trials. Her arguments were polished and persuasive, yet the presiding judge hesitated. Too many legal entanglements surrounded the fund. Behind her strong facade, Claudia was fraying. Her nights grew longer, her temper sharper. Even her conversations with Edward, once smooth, now bristled with tension. Maya sensed the unease growing. She wasn't certain what was wrong, but she knew the story unfolding in public was not the same story whispered within those walls. She wrestled with herself. Should she remain silent or risk asking questions no one wanted asked? As the weeks wore on, Edward's public appearances grew more polished, while the home grew more strained. And Maya, walking those hushed halls, realized that the boy was not the only one in danger. Something larger, darker was unfolding, and sooner or later the truth would break free. The Whitmore estate was quiet, its halls heavy with polished wood and portraits that watched from the walls. To the public, Edward appeared noble, his mission one of sacrifice. But inside those walls, Maya felt the weight of something hidden. She had begun keeping mental notes. Edward's late-night calls, Claudia's hurried whispers, Daniel's stillness whenever his father entered the room. It wasn't her place, she knew. She was a housemaid. Yet the unease gnawed at her. Edward, meanwhile, continued shaping his performance. He delivered interviews with practiced sorrow, telling hosts that he would give away his fortune if it meant Daniel could one day say, "Father." Each word sounded sincere, each gesture rehearsed. America was captivated. Donations and letters of support poured in, but Daniel, the boy at the center of it all, remained unseen. Cameras were never allowed near him. Edward always had an excuse. The child was fragile, overwhelmed by attention. The public accepted it. After all, Edward Whitmore was respected, admired, untouchable. In private, Daniel's reality was different. He stayed secluded in his room, his eyes darting whenever Edward's footsteps echoed down the corridor. Maya had grown used to the boy's silence, but she also saw his subtle signs. His shoulders tightening when his father approached, the relief when Edward left. Daniel wasn't simply quiet, he was afraid. One evening, as Maya prepared dinner in the main kitchen, she heard Edward's voice carry from his study. His words were sharp. "We can't delay this any longer. Questions are piling up." Claudia's reply was lower, urgent. Maya caught only fragments. The fund. Transfers. They're asking for proof. Then silence. She returned to her work, her pulse quickening. The court delays continued. Claudia filed motions, begged for emergency sessions, argued that Daniel's therapy had a limited window. She painted a picture of urgency, one that the press devoured. Yet the judge remained cautious, demanding clarity before releasing millions of dollars. Behind closed doors, Claudia's resolve cracked. She paced the estate at night, her phone pressed to her ear, her tone brittle. She and Edward quarreled more often. Their partnership, once seamless, now carried tension sharp enough to cut through the marble halls. Maya felt the strain too. She wasn't meant to overhear these things, yet the walls of the Whitmore estate carried every whisper. She began to wonder whether Daniel's therapy was real, or whether something far more sinister lay beneath. She thought about confiding in someone, but who would believe her? She was just a maid in a mansion. Still, she started to watch more carefully. She wrote down times, dates, even stray words she overheard. At night, when the estate fell quiet, she walked past Daniel's room, pausing at the door. He sat there, clutching a stuffed bear, staring at nothing. It broke her heart. The public campaign, however, marched forward. Edward appeared on television again, his suit immaculate, his hair grayer than before, his voice quivering with emotion. He told America that every day without the therapy was another day stolen from his son. "Time is running out," he said. Viewers leaned forward, some even weeping. To them, Edward was the portrait of a father's love. But Maya, inside the estate, knew that Daniel never smiled the way Edward described. She knew he was more at peace in silence with her than with his father's presence. And the more she noticed, the more she realized that something in Edward's story didn't add up. Her breaking point came late one night. Passing Edward's study, she heard him speaking with Claudia again. His tone was controlled, but underneath, sharp. "If this document doesn't surface, we'll lose the window," he said. Claudia responded quickly. "Then we buy more time." "But she—" The sentence trailed off. Then came Edward's voice, colder. "Maya, has she seen anything?" Her blood ran cold. She stepped back from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She hurried to her room, every step heavy with dread. They were speaking about her. They suspected her. And if Edward was hiding something, if Claudia was covering for him, then she was already too close. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She didn't have answers. But she knew one thing. The truth inside the Whitmore estate was different from the story America believed. And the boy asleep across the hall was at the very center of it. The day of reckoning came soon after. The court had demanded the confidential file, the one Edward claimed would unlock Daniel's future. Reporters filled the steps of the Riverside courthouse. Edward arrived pale, sweating, his charm cracking. Cameras flashed as he raised his hand and spoke. His words stunned the room. "The document," he said, his voice strained, "is gone." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Claudia stood beside him, stiff, her jaw clenched. Edward continued. He claimed the file had been stolen from his study during the night. And then, without pause, he pointed the blame directly. "It was Maya Williams," he declared. "Our housemaid. She took it." The statement fell like thunder. Journalists scribbled furiously. Inside the courthouse, whispers filled the chamber. Claudia said nothing at first, but when pressed, she nodded, confirming Edward's words. She added that Maya had been behaving oddly, that she had shown signs of resentment. Maya was summoned into a private room. Confused, trembling, she denied everything. She explained she had spent the night cleaning guest rooms, preparing meals, doing her work as always. But the eyes around her were doubtful. Claudia, calm and collected, spoke firmly. Maya had been acting strangely. Edward's accusation carried weight. Whispers spread. Some pitied Maya, others believed Edward without question. And under his pressure, the judge gave his ruling. Maya was to be removed from the estate immediately. She was forbidden contact with the family until further notice. As she was escorted out, Daniel stood in the hallway, his bear clutched tight. His eyes followed her, steady, unblinking. He didn't say a word. He never did. But there was something in the way he watched her leave. A quiet focus. An understanding no one else noticed. Edward placed a hand on his son's shoulder and told the reporters that Daniel was frightened, confused, and that he would protect him. Cameras captured the image. A father shielding his fragile boy. But behind those walls, something entirely different was taking shape. Back at the Whitmore estate, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. Edward's accusation had changed everything. Reporters swarmed the gates. Headlines screamed about the missing document, the loyal maid turned suspect, and the desperate father fighting against time. Maya Williams had been cast out. The staff avoided mentioning her name, afraid of drawing Edward's suspicion. Yet the absence was felt most in Daniel's quiet room. Without Maya's steady presence, he grew even more withdrawn. He clutched his bear tighter, lingered longer in the corners, and rarely left his bed. That evening, when the estate grew hushed, Daniel crept to his room's toy chest. He waited until footsteps faded down the hall, then reached beneath the wooden lid. From the shadows he pulled out a folded sheet of paper, its edges bent from handling. He studied it silently. It was the very document that had supposedly vanished. He examined the lines, the signatures, though he couldn't understand their meaning. After a moment he tucked it into a box of toys and closed the lid. His small hands pressed firmly, as though sealing away a secret. No one saw him. Downstairs, Edward and Claudia argued. Their voices carried, sharp and clipped. The police had arrived earlier that day, moving through the study with gloves and cameras. They dusted for prints, took photos of the open drawer, asked Edward routine questions. He played the part of the wronged father, insisting he kept the file under lock, only to discover it gone. Claudia added her suspicions, repeating that Maya had acted jealous, even threatening. The officers wrote in their notebooks, collected what evidence they could, and left with promises to return. Claudia pressed the court for swift action, reminding the judge that Daniel's medical window was closing. She demanded an emergency session. The judge granted 30 more days, no more. If the document was not produced by then, the case would collapse. The newspapers devoured it. Headlines questioned Maya's loyalty. Talk shows debated whether Edward was the victim of betrayal or manipulation. Some defended Maya online, saying the story didn't add up. Others took Edward's side, citing his wealth and influence as proof he couldn't possibly lie about his own son's health. Inside the estate, the air grew taut. Claudia buried herself in files, her face tight with exhaustion. Edward spent hours locked in his study, pacing, making endless phone calls. Daniel retreated deeper into silence. But in truth, he wasn't just silent. He was listening. Each night, after the house quieted, he sat near his door. His eyes traced the shadows under the frame. His ears, once thought useless, caught fragments of sound. At first it was muffled. Footsteps, chairs scraping, the hum of appliances. But then faint voices seeped through, his father's voice deep and tense. Claudia's, clipped and urgent. Daniel pressed closer, memorizing every word he could make out. Mornings followed the same ritual. Edward entered Daniel's room with a small brown bottle and spoon. The liquid inside smelled sharp, bitter. Daniel frowned at the sight, but obediently opened his mouth. Edward insisted these drops were medicine, necessary, vital for his condition. He gave them himself, never allowing a nurse to interfere. But something in the routine troubled Daniel. The way his father gripped the bottle, shielding the label. The way he refused to let anyone else touch it. The heaviness Daniel felt afterward, his head foggy, his body slow. These were things he noticed, though he said nothing. When Maya was banished, she tried to reach Daniel anyway. She sent messages through a neighbor, asking about him. Once, she even left a toy at the south gate, hoping he would see it. But Edward found it and had it discarded. She has no right to interfere, he told the staff. Daniel never heard from her again, yet he remembered her words. Once, in a quiet moment, Maya had leaned close and whispered, "Someday you'll know the truth." He thought of it often as he swallowed the bitter liquid, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, as he heard voices drift through the walls. And then one morning he decided he would no longer swallow the medicine. When Edward appeared, spoon in hand, Daniel opened his mouth as always. But this time he let the drops sit on his tongue. He waited until his father left the room, then spat the liquid into a tissue and hid it behind the dresser. The next day he did the same, and the next Edward suspected nothing. He believed his son still followed orders. As the days passed, Daniel began to feel a change. The heaviness that had weighed on him lifted. The fog receded. His thoughts grew clearer. He began to hear more distinctly the ticking of the clock, the shuffle of footsteps, the faint rumble of cars outside. Sounds that had never reached him before. At first, they frightened him, but then they fascinated him. Whispers through the walls sharpened. He caught Claudia's voice during late-night calls, Edward's clipped replies. Phrases emerged. Transfers, deadlines, buying time. None of it sounded like medicine or healing. The realization dawned slowly, chillingly. Perhaps his condition had never been what his father claimed. Perhaps the drops, not his brain, had kept him silent. He told no one, not yet. Instead, he listened harder, his small body pressed against the wood of the door, his ears straining for clarity. Each night the walls of the estate spoke. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, was beginning to hear the truth. Night after night, Daniel lay awake in the Whitmore estate, no longer lost in silence, but tuned to the sounds that filled the great halls. What had once been a void was now alive with whispers, footsteps, doors creaking, the low hum of conversations drifting up from Edward's study. At first he barely understood the words. They were scattered pieces, funds, board approval, 30 days. But the more he listened, the sharper his understanding grew. Edward and Claudia never imagined the boy could hear them. They spoke freely, convinced his silence was impenetrable. Daniel began to piece the puzzle together. One evening he pressed his ear to the wall and caught Claudia's voice, calm and cold. "If this boy ever speaks, we lose everything." The words made him freeze. His small body curled in the bed, heart pounding. Why would her livelihood, their entire scheme, depend on his silence? It struck him with terrifying clarity. The medicine, the lies, the missing document, it was all connected. He didn't move for a long time after that. He sat with his knees tucked to his chest, the stuffed bear in his hands. For the first time he realized that his silence was not natural. It had been engineered. Still, Daniel said nothing. He was afraid. What if Edward discovered his growing awareness? What if Claudia suspected? He could not risk it, not yet. But he also knew he could not remain passive. He needed something more than memory. He needed proof. One afternoon, while sifting through his toy chest, Daniel uncovered an old red recorder. A simple device with only 2 buttons, record and play. Its batteries were weak, but it worked. He tested it by humming softly and playing it back, startled to hear his own sound echo in the room. The audio was scratchy, but clear enough. That night, when Edward and Claudia settled into their study, Daniel placed the recorder near his door, hidden under a stack of books. He pressed record and waited. Their voices filled the air again, low but steady. When he retrieved the recorder the next morning and played it back, he heard them. Distorted, faint, but undeniable. Words about transfers, deadlines, and lies. From then on, it became his routine. Each night, he set the recorder. Each morning, he hid the tapes. He labeled them with small stickers, numbers in order, and stashed them beneath a loose floorboard under his bed. His secret archive grew, piece by piece. The tapes revealed enough to terrify him further. Claudia once said, "We just need 30 more days. He's only a child. No one will believe him." Edward muttered late one night, "We've come too far to stop now." Though they never spoke directly of the medicine, their words circled Daniel's condition, always framing his silence as essential to their survival. He didn't understand every term, every reference, but he understood the core. They weren't trying to heal him. They were keeping him this way for their gain. The knowledge both frightened and empowered him. For the first time, Daniel held something of his own, the truth captured on tape. During the day, he played the part expected of him. He sat quietly with his toys, ate meals in silence, and avoided eye contact. But inside he was a child transformed. He was planning, gathering, waiting. He began collecting small objects, tucking them beneath the floorboard alongside the tapes. A flashlight, extra batteries, a small notebook, even an old key that Maya had once left in a drawer. He didn't know why he prepared, only that it gave him comfort. For once he wasn't powerless. The estate remained tense. Edward still appeared in public, delivering interviews with tears in his eyes. Claudia still strode through the halls with files and phones. But in Daniel's room, a quiet revolution was taking place. Every night, the recorder captured fragments of their scheme. Every day, Daniel organized his findings. The boy they thought broken was learning, thinking, and preparing. The turning point came when the court allowed Maya Williams a supervised visit. Weeks had passed since she'd been banished. A social worker, Mrs. Palmer, escorted her inside the estate, keeping a close watch. Daniel waited in the living room, stiff and uneasy, his stuffed bear pressed to his chest. When Maya entered, her eyes softened. She sat beside him gently, unsure if he would turn away. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then Daniel leaned closer. He opened his mouth. The sound was rough, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Maya. Her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes. But before she could respond, Daniel lifted his finger to his lips. He didn't want anyone else to hear. She nodded, her heart aching. Something had shifted. The boy had chosen to speak, and he had chosen her. They moved upstairs with permission from the social worker, who assumed they only wanted privacy. In Daniel's room, he knelt by his bed and pried up the loose floorboard. From beneath, he pulled a small box. Inside lay batteries, scraps of paper, and the red recorder. He placed it in Maya's hands. She looked confused until he pointed to the play button. She pressed it. Static filled the air, then voices. Edward and Claudia. Faint but distinct. Words about money, lies, and silence. "If this boy starts talking, we lose everything," Claudia's voice said. Maya froze. Her hands trembled. She looked at Daniel. He nodded slowly, showing her more tapes. Piece by piece, the truth unraveled in her ears. Maya knew then that Daniel had not been broken. He had been silenced, and now, with his courage and his recordings, he was giving her the key to expose the darkness at the heart of the Whitmore estate. Maya left the Whitmore estate shaken. She carried the recorder close, her heart heavy with what she had just heard. For years she had suspected something was wrong, but now there was no denying it. The child had not been born broken, he had been kept that way. And the proof was in her hands. She couldn't act immediately. The recordings were compelling, but she needed something more, something official. So she reached out quietly to an old friend, Dr. Samuel Carter, a physician who had once worked with the Whitmore family, but left under quiet circumstances. Maya trusted him. Without giving names, she explained what she suspected and asked if he would evaluate Daniel discreetly. Dr. Carter agreed. A few days later, under the pretense of a routine checkup, Maya brought Daniel to St. Mary's Clinic. The visit was arranged through the court as part of the supervised care sessions. The boy was calm as the doctor examined him, running neurological tests, hearing exams, and drawing blood for analysis. Daniel followed instructions, silent but attentive. When the appointment ended, Dr. Carter said little, only promising to review everything carefully. 2 days later, his call came. His voice was grave. "Maya, you need to sit down." The words that followed made her blood run cold. Daniel had never been disabled. His hearing and cognitive tests were normal. His silence, his lethargy, it was not a genetic condition. The blood work revealed traces of a strong sedative, administered consistently over years. It was a drug never approved for children, one capable of suppressing speech and motor function if given repeatedly. Maya nearly dropped the phone. Someone had drugged Daniel to appear impaired. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. That night she lay awake, replaying everything. Edward's public tears, Claudia's polished arguments, the missing document, the whispers about buying time. It all fit together now. Daniel had been used, his silence exploited. But why? Money, sympathy, control. The missing document had to hold the answer. She resolved to act. She began cataloguing everything she knew, names, dates, overheard words, the contents of the tapes. She made copies, saving them on a USB drive and uploading files to a secure folder online. She asked Dr. Carter to prepare an official report. He agreed but warned her to tread carefully. From then on, Maya became a detective in the shadows. She started asking quiet questions, reviewing public filings on Edward's business interests, probing into the International Research Fund that had supposedly held Daniel's salvation. Many people refused to talk. Some seemed nervous, but bit by bit she uncovered patterns, offshore accounts, shell corporations, transactions tied back to Edward's empire. And still, the document remained missing. Then, one quiet afternoon, during another supervised visit, Daniel himself revealed it. He kept glancing at the corner of his room where an old wooden toy cabinet stood. Maya followed his gaze, finally opening it. Inside, among dusty dolls and puzzles, she found a worn teddy bear. Its seam was torn, stuffing poking out. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it down. Inside the rip was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. When she opened it, her breath caught. It was the confidential document Edward had claimed was stolen. The pages were filled with bank transfers, authorizations, signatures, proof that the research fund had been manipulated, siphoned for purposes unrelated to Daniel's care. Some of the money had been funneled to a corporation tied to Claudia. Other transfers led straight back to Edward's network. Maya's stomach turned. The therapy was never the goal. The entire ordeal had been a cover to unlock millions. Daniel had hidden the document himself, protecting it in the only way he knew. She looked at him, her eyes brimming. He stared back, silent but steady. She whispered, "You were so brave." From that moment she knew what had to be done. She gathered the evidence, the tapes, the doctor's report, and now the document. She prepared a small bag with essentials, clothes for Daniel, food, water, and the papers sealed in a pouch. She knew Edward would come after her once he discovered the truth. That evening, as the sun set over the estate, she heard footsteps downstairs. Edward had returned early. Her pulse spiked. She grabbed Daniel's hand and led him toward the back exit near the laundry room. They slipped through the south gate, hearts pounding, and hailed a cab. The driver asked no questions. Maya gave him the address of a small Maplewood apartment near the courthouse, where she planned to regroup. Daniel sat quietly beside her, clutching his bear. As the city lights blurred past the window, she knew there was no turning back. In the apartment that night, Maya spread the papers across the table, reviewing every detail again and again. Daniel pointed to names he remembered hearing in whispered conversations. His memory was astonishing. Though his words were few, his awareness was crystal clear. They weren't just fighting for money anymore. They were fighting for truth. Morning would bring the final hearing at the Riverside courthouse. Maya contacted Dr. Carter, arranging to meet before the session. Together they would deliver the evidence to Judge Harrison, but she knew Edward and Claudia would not sit quietly. Somewhere in the city, they would already be scheming. Realizing the document was no longer under their control, she locked the apartment door, turned off the lights, and told Daniel to rest. He curled on the couch, his bear pressed to his chest. She sat beside him, whispering a promise. "Tomorrow we show them the truth." The next morning, the Riverside courthouse was overflowing. Every bench was filled, reporters scribbling in notepads, attorneys whispering among themselves, social workers and curious citizens waiting for the drama to unfold. The case had grown into a national spectacle, and now the final hearing would decide it all. Edward Whitmore sat at the front with Claudia Reynolds at his side. Both wore dark suits, their faces drawn tight. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but their reputations hung in the balance. Edward's expression was calm, almost fatherly, as he prepared to speak. When Judge Harrison called the session to order, Edward rose. His voice was steady, full of practiced sorrow. "My son has been kidnapped," he declared. Gasps rippled across the room. He pointed his words at Maya, accusing her of being unstable, of manipulating Daniel, of forging documents to deceive the court. Claudia followed, her voice sharp. She painted Maya as an obsessive servant who had always overstepped her role, a woman unfit to be near the child. Her words echoed with conviction, leaving many in the gallery unsure what to believe. Then the wooden doors at the back opened. Heads turned. Silence swept the room. Maya walked forward, calm, composed, holding Daniel's hand. She wore no theatrics, no makeup. Daniel, in plain clothes, stared ahead with quiet determination. They walked to the front, every step echoing. The judge looked up, startled. "Who permitted them entry?" A security officer explained that Maya and Daniel were already approved on the visitor list. Judge Harrison nodded, then asked directly, "Do you wish to speak?" Daniel let go of Maya's hand, stepped forward, and for the first time in public, spoke clearly. "My father is lying." The words seemed to shake the walls. Gasps, whispers, a stunned silence. The boy who had never spoken had just shattered the narrative. The judge banged his gavel for order, all eyes fixed on the child. Daniel stood steady, his small frame upright, his voice firm. Maya moved closer, placing a thick folder on the judge's desk. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, "this is the document Mr. Whitmore claimed was stolen. And this," she added, handing another file, "is Dr. Carter's signed medical report." Judge Harrison gestured for Officer Brooks to deliver the files. He scanned them, his expression unreadable. The courtroom held its breath. Maya explained in brief, clear sentences. Daniel had been administered an unprescribed sedative for years, a drug that suppressed his speech and cognitive development. The purpose was not medical treatment, but to create the appearance of disability, enabling Edward and Claudia to siphon funds from the international research account. Daniel nodded as she spoke, affirming her words. Suddenly, Claudia leapt to her feet. Her voice cracked with fury. "This is a setup. Lies, fabrication!" She lunged toward the folder, trying to snatch it from the judge's desk. Chaos erupted. Reporters scribbled wildly. People shouted. Judge Harrison rose, his voice booming. "Order!" Claudia ignored him, her voice rising, calling the court blind and corrupt. At last the judge's tone sharpened. "Remove her! Charge her with contempt." 2 officers approached. Claudia resisted, but they escorted her out, her protests echoing in the hall. The gallery buzzed, stunned. Edward sat motionless, pale. He hadn't expected this. Not Daniel's voice, not Maya's evidence. For once the mask slipped. He looked like a man cornered. The judge announced a recess to review the documents in detail. Reporters hurried out, rushing to send the news. Daniel sat beside Maya, holding her hand again. His face was weary, but there was a lightness in his eyes, as if some invisible burden had lifted. When the session resumed later that day, the atmosphere was even heavier. Dr. Carter entered with additional medical files, lab results, charts confirming the presence of unprescribed chemicals in Daniel's body. Experts authenticated the documents, every piece aligned, the missing file, the doctor's findings, the recordings Maya provided. Judge Harrison's tone was solemn as he addressed the court. "The evidence is compelling. What began as suspicion is now substantiated by medical fact and financial proof. This court cannot ignore it," reporters scribbled furiously. Maya squeezed Daniel's hand. The judge continued, "A formal criminal inquiry is hereby opened. Mr. Whitmore will remain in the city under supervision. Ms. Reynolds will remain in custody." The room erupted again. This time it wasn't disbelief. It was relief. For the first time, the tide had turned. Edward's shoulders slumped. Claudia was gone, her voice silenced. And Daniel, silent no more, had been heard. 3 days later, the courthouse gathered once more. A sealed forensic report had arrived, its contents to be read in open court. Judge Harrison presided with the same steady authority, flanked by legal representatives and Dr. Samuel Carter. Maya sat beside Daniel in the gallery, her hand clasping his. The boy clutched his bear, his eyes fixed on the judge. He didn't fidget. He didn't look away. He was ready. The judge broke the seal and began to read. The room hushed. The report confirmed what Maya and Dr. Carter already knew. Daniel had been administered a combination of chemical agents over a prolonged period. These substances, never intended for children, had produced symptoms of hearing loss and speech suppression. They were unapproved for any legitimate therapy. His condition had not been neurological. It had been induced. The gallery stirred. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. The truth was no longer suspicion, it was confirmed fact. Judge Harrison paused, then lifted the second document, the confidential file Daniel had hidden in his teddy bear. A financial fraud expert had already verified its authenticity. The paper detailed the structure of the International Research Fund, exposing how its money had been diverted. On the surface, the fund looked noble, a reserve for rare medical cases. But in practice it was controlled by a shell corporation with no real staff or operations. Its accounts funneled millions into Edward Whitmore's network of businesses, with Claudia Reynolds listed as a silent partner. The courtroom grew tense as the judge read aloud excerpts. Transfers to offshore accounts, contracts tied to non-existent treatments, signatures connecting the fraud to Edward himself. Then came the recordings. One by one, Daniel's tapes were played. The sound was scratchy but clear. Edward's voice filled the room. "As long as the boy doesn't speak, we're safe." Gasps echoed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Another tape followed, Claudia's voice cutting cold. "If this falls apart, we lose everything." The words reverberated through the chamber. No one moved. The defense had no objections. There was nothing left to challenge. For hours, the courtroom absorbed the evidence, medical proof, financial documents, recorded admissions. Piece by piece, the story laid bare a scheme that had exploited a child's silence for greed. Finally, Judge Harrison set the papers aside. He adjusted his glasses, his voice clear and firm. "This court finds Edward Whitmore and Claudia Reynolds guilty of fraud, child abuse, and attempted embezzlement of international funds." The decision struck like a hammer. Officers moved forward. Edward sat pale, his shoulders sagging. He didn't resist as handcuffs were fastened to his wrists. Claudia, already in custody, was led back into the chamber to hear the judgment. Her face was hardened, her defiance gone. The gallery erupted, reporters rushing for the exits, whispers colliding in the air. Maya held Daniel close, her arm wrapped around him. The boy did not smile, but his eyes followed Edward as he was led away. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. Outside headlines spread like wildfire. Billionaire and lawyer convicted in child abuse and fraud scandal. News outlets across the nation reported every detail. The Whitmore empire, once untouchable, was collapsing. Inside the courthouse, the conversation turned to Daniel's future. Social workers convened, reviewing his case. With both biological parents now facing criminal charges and no relatives stepping forward, the court had to decide who would take responsibility for him. Every report, every observation pointed to one name, Maya Williams. She had cared for him not out of obligation, but out of love. She had protected him when no one else did. Psychologists and caseworkers spent time with them both, observing their interactions. Daniel sat easily beside her, calm when she was near, anxious when she wasn't. Their bond was undeniable. At the custody hearing days later, the room was quiet. No cameras, no swarm of reporters, only officials, Maya and Daniel. The judge reviewed the reports aloud. Then he looked directly at the boy. "Daniel, do you wish to say anything?" Daniel lifted his head, his voice steady. "She is my real family." The words brought tears to Maya's eyes. For the first time, Daniel had spoken in court without fear. Judge Harrison leaned forward, a faint smile breaking through. "I have heard enough." With a stroke of his pen, he signed the papers. Maya Williams was now Daniel Whitmore's legal guardian. The boy who had once been silent now had a voice and a home. The judge addressed one more matter, Daniel's financial security. Edward's assets were being seized, but the court ruled that the portion meant for Daniel's medical care would be placed in a protected trust. Maya was named trustee, responsible for managing his needs, education and well-being under court oversight. Maya accepted without hesitation. She had never cared for wealth. Her only concern was Daniel's safety. But knowing he would have resources for school and healing lifted a weight from her heart. Reporters caught the story as it spread beyond the courthouse. Photos showed Maya holding Daniel's hand outside the steps, his face calm, her expression proud. Headlines captured the moment. The boy who found his voice. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a story of survival, justice, and unexpected family. In the weeks that followed, the media storm grew louder. News outlets across the country broadcast the photographs of Daniel and Maya leaving the courthouse, his small hand in hers, her face marked with quiet resolve. Articles ran headlines like, "Boy once thought mute brings down billionaire," and "A child's voice shakes the system." For Maya, the attention was overwhelming. Journalists called day and night, desperate for interviews. She declined almost all of them, shielding Daniel from the spotlight. Only once did she agree to speak publicly, choosing a trusted reporter. Her words were simple. He's not a case. He's not a victim. He's a boy who was brave enough to speak when it mattered most. That single sentence spread across newspapers and social media. To the public, it became the defining line of the story. Some called it justice. Others called it a miracle. But for Maya and Daniel, it was simply the start of a new life. They moved to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. It was no mansion, but it was warm and safe. Daniel had his own room, with shelves for books, space for drawings, and light that streamed through the window each morning. Their days found rhythm. Breakfast together at the table, walks in the neighborhood, bedtime stories read aloud by Maya, sometimes with Daniel adding a few whispered words of his own. He was still shy with his voice, but each word carried weight. Maya enrolled him at Cedar Grove Academy, a school known for supporting children who had endured trauma. Teachers welcomed him with patience and gentle encouragement. At first, Daniel spoke very little, but slowly he began to answer questions, raise his hand, even laugh at a classmate's joke. The boy, once thought incapable of speech, was learning to be a child again. Maya attended every meeting, guided him with homework, cheered when he brought home drawings or solved math problems. The trust fund secured his material needs, but it was the emotional stability, the safety of being believed and loved that transformed him. Months passed. Daniel began to flourish. He made friends, played soccer at recess, and proudly shared his sketches with Maya. She watched each step of his growth with quiet pride. On the anniversary of the trial, a journalist mailed her a copy of the old front page. "Boy who found his voice brings down billionaire with his words." A note was attached. "Thank you for changing the story." Maya folded the paper carefully and placed it in a keepsake box for Daniel. She wanted him to remember, not the pain, but his strength. That evening they had a simple dinner together and watched one of Daniel's favorite films. Before bed, he handed her a drawing he had made, 2 figures standing under a tree holding hands. At the bottom, in his careful letters, he had written, "My family." Maya hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. Justice had been done, but more importantly, love had prevailed. As time passed, she realized their story could not end with them alone. What happened to Daniel had opened her eyes to how many other children suffered in silence. She decided to act. With the help of Dr. Carter, social workers, and a small group of allies, she founded the Haven Project, a center dedicated to protecting and supporting children who had been neglected or abused. It provided therapy, legal resources, and a safe environment for recovery. Daniel helped design its logo, a simple drawing of a child holding a microphone, a symbol of finding one's voice. Volunteers came quickly, donations followed, and soon the Haven Project began welcoming children from across the city. Word spread fast. People remembered Daniel's case and connected the project with hope. Media outlets revisited the story, but Maya made sure the focus stayed on the children, not the scandal. She agreed to limited interviews, only when it meant raising awareness for those who still needed help. Lawmakers also began paying attention. They invited Maya to speak about child protection policies, about how easily Daniel had been hidden in plain sight despite his father's wealth. Legislators drafted reforms to strengthen oversight of private medical treatments tied to funding programs. One bill, unofficially dubbed the Daniel Act, proposed stricter monitoring of child welfare cases. Maya never sought politics, but she was proud that Daniel's courage was sparking systemic change. Each time she saw a new child at the Haven Project smile or speak after weeks of silence, she knew the fight had been worth it. Daniel, too, found a place in the Haven Project. He visited often, reading books in the corner, sketching pictures, or simply sitting with other children. He never shared his full past, but his presence comforted those who still felt afraid. He had once been voiceless himself, and now his quiet empathy helped others heal. One afternoon, a filmmaker approached Maya with an idea, a documentary about Daniel's journey and the mission of the Haven Project. At first she hesitated, protective of his privacy, but after careful thought and Daniel's own agreement, she accepted, with the condition that the story focus on hope and healing. Filming began quietly. Daniel chose what to share. He spoke honestly but without self-pity. The cameras followed him at school, at the center, at home. Interviews with Maya, Dr. Carter, and teachers painted the full picture, the silence, the manipulation, the trial, and the aftermath. When the documentary premiered at a small festival, the response was overwhelming. Viewers wept, applauded, and wrote letters of thanks. Some shared their own experiences of childhood neglect. Others said they felt inspired to volunteer or advocate for children in need. Clips spread online. The final scene became the most powerful. Daniel, standing in front of a plain white wall, holding a slip of paper, his voice calm and steady. "They wanted to silence me, but no one can silence the truth." The screen faded to black. Audiences around the world carried that line with them. It wasn't just a boy's declaration. It was a universal reminder that truth cannot be buried forever. Maya watched the film alone the first time. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow but of pride. She saw the boy who had once been quiet and broken, now standing strong, kind and brave. Daniel returned to his ordinary life after the release. No fame, no spectacle, just school, soccer, art and evenings with Maya. But his words had already become a symbol, echoing far beyond their home. A voice once forced into silence was finally free. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Several months had passed since the final ruling, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore experienced something close to normalcy. He woke each morning in the small house he now shared with Maya. Breakfast was simple: toast, fruit, sometimes pancakes, but it was always together. He packed his backpack for Cedar Grove Academy, walked through its doors like any other child, and sat in classrooms where he was treated not as a case, not as a headline, but simply as Daniel. The transformation was remarkable. Words came easily now. He answered questions in class, asked for help when he needed it, even offered to assist classmates struggling with math. His teachers were amazed by the speed of his growth. He was catching up fast, not just academically but socially. At recess he played soccer, laughing with friends, his voice ringing across the playground. After school, he climbed into Maya's car, chatting about his day, what subjects he liked, what books he wanted to read, which games he had played. The silence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a clear, strong voice. At home, Maya kept things structured: chores, homework, then free time for drawing or reading. But she also made space for fun. They had movie nights, board games, and small trips to the park. For Daniel, these simple routines were luxuries he had never known at the estate. Yet Maya could not ignore the larger truth. What happened to Daniel had opened her eyes to how many children lived voiceless, unseen. She poured her energy into the Haven Project, which had grown steadily since its founding. The center became a haven in every sense of the word. Children arrived timid, fearful, some reluctant to speak. Therapists worked with them patiently. Legal advisors guided their cases. Volunteers played games and read stories. Slowly, one by one, these children began to heal. Daniel often accompanied Maya. He sat in the reading corner, sketchbook in hand. Sometimes other children sat beside him, sharing crayons or puzzles. He wasn't always talkative, but his calm presence drew them in. He understood their silence because he had lived it. One child, a girl who hadn't spoken in months, once sat next to Daniel as he drew. Without saying a word, he slid her a crayon. She looked at him, then drew a flower. The two of them sat together, coloring side by side. No words exchanged, but the ice was broken. By the end of the week, she whispered her first word in therapy. Maya watched quietly, tears in her eyes. Daniel's healing had become part of theirs. The Haven Project caught wider attention. Articles appeared in national papers. Lawmakers referenced Daniel's case when pushing for reforms. The proposed Daniel Act gained traction, with provisions requiring stronger oversight of children's medical treatments tied to funding programs. Maya attended hearings, always careful to keep Daniel shielded from politics, but proud that his story was changing the system. Not long after, a filmmaker's documentary about Daniel and the Haven Project was released more widely. It aired on television and online platforms. The reaction was immediate. Viewers praised its honesty, its focus on hope rather than tragedy. Letters poured in, some from survivors of abuse, others from ordinary families who felt inspired to volunteer or donate. Educators began using the film in training programs for social workers and teachers. Its final scene, Daniel standing tall and saying, "They wanted to silence me, but no one can silence the truth," became a refrain repeated in classrooms, churches, and advocacy groups. The film changed lives. But for Daniel, it was simply a moment. He returned to school the next day, had lunch with friends, and went home to do his homework. Fame didn't interest him. What mattered was the quiet, steady life he now lived. Maya, too, kept her focus on him. Each evening, after the bustle of the Haven Project and her responsibilities as trustee of his fund, she sat at the kitchen table with Daniel. They talked about his drawings, his friends, his dreams. She wanted him to grow, not as a symbol, but as a boy, safe, loved, and free. The world outside could call him a hero, a miracle, a survivor. But inside that small home, he was just Daniel, and that was enough. The months turned into a year, and with each passing day, Daniel's world became brighter, fuller, and more ordinary in the best sense of the word. The boy who had once been kept in shadows was now standing in sunlight, his life rebuilt not on lies, but on truth and trust. The trial was over, the scandal exposed, and Edward Whitmore and Claudia Reynolds had been convicted. They were behind bars, their power dismantled, their reputations destroyed. Yet for Maya and Daniel, the true story had never been about a billionaire's fall. It had been about a child's rise. Each morning, Daniel woke in his own room at the little house. The walls were painted a gentle blue, decorated with his sketches and shelves of books. On the windowsill sat the same teddy bear that had once hidden the document which changed everything. Now it was just a toy, no longer a hiding place, no longer a burden. Maya made breakfast while he packed his backpack. Sometimes he joined her at the stove, flipping pancakes with exaggerated care, grinning when he managed to land one without spilling. These small moments of laughter became part of their routine. At Cedar Grove Academy, Daniel thrived. Teachers noted how quickly he absorbed lessons, how attentive he was, how eager he had become to answer. Once, during a reading exercise, he volunteered to stand before the class and recite. His voice was steady, his words clear. For many of his classmates, it was just another reading. But for Daniel, it was a triumph, and for Maya, who had sat in on the session at the teacher's invitation, it was a miracle. After school, he sometimes lingered on the playground, kicking a soccer ball with friends until the sun dipped low. Other times he hurried home, eager to show Maya a drawing or tell her about something he had learned. His voice, once forced into silence, now filled their home every day. Meanwhile, the Haven Project grew into something much larger than Maya had ever imagined. At first, it had been a small center with a few rooms and a handful of volunteers. But word spread. Families reached out asking for help. Donations increased. Lawyers, therapists, and teachers offered their time. Within a year, the center had doubled in size. There were now classrooms for tutoring, quiet rooms for therapy, and a garden where children could play safely. The walls were lined with art, much of it drawn by the very children the center served. Daniel often visited. He never flaunted his story, but the children seemed drawn to him. Some sat silently beside him as he sketched. Others listened when he read aloud from books. He wasn't just a boy who had found his voice. He was a boy who gave others courage to search for theirs. Maya watched this with quiet pride. She knew he still carried memories of his past, the medicine, the fear, the silence. But she also knew he was healing, not in leaps, but in steady steps. And every time a child at the Haven Project spoke for the first time, she saw Daniel's legacy in action. Though their life was peaceful, the past could not be erased entirely. At times, Daniel still woke in the night, clutching his bear, shaken by dreams of the estate and its cold marble halls. Maya would sit beside him until he calmed, whispering reassurances. He also asked questions. About his father, about Claudia, about why people who were supposed to love him had chosen lies instead. Maya answered as gently as she could. She didn't shield him from the truth, but she gave him perspective, that what had been done to him was evil. Yes, but it did not define who he was or who he would become. Once, as they sat together on the porch, Daniel asked, "Why did they want me quiet?" Maya took his hand. "Because the truth scared them," she said. "But you were braver than their lies." "You still are." He nodded, thoughtful, his young mind piecing together a world that had once been hidden from him. The story of Daniel's courage and Maya's devotion did not fade. A year after the trial, community leaders organized a small ceremony at the town hall to honor them both. The mayor presented Maya with a plaque for her work in child advocacy. Daniel received a standing ovation when he walked to the podium. He spoke only briefly, his words simple but powerful. "They wanted me silent, but I spoke, and now other children can too." The audience of parents, teachers, and officials erupted in applause. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she watched him. This was the boy she had once found curled in silence, now standing tall and speaking to a crowd. The documentary continued to circulate, finding new audiences. It was shown in classrooms, at conferences, in training sessions for social workers. Every screening ended with Daniel's words, "No one can silence the truth." Viewers wrote letters from across the country. Some told Daniel how his story inspired them to leave abusive homes. Others said they had volunteered at children's centers because of him. His small voice had become a movement, but Maya was careful to keep him grounded. At home, he was not a symbol. He was simply Daniel, a boy who liked to draw, who played soccer, who sometimes left his socks on the floor and forgot to put away his pencils. And that, she believed, was the greatest gift of all, the chance to be ordinary. 3 years after the trial, final appeals had run their course. Edward Whitmore and Claudia Reynolds remained convicted, their sentences firm. Edward's empire had been dismantled, his wealth seized to repay fraud victims and support the fund he had once exploited. Maya and Daniel attended one last court session, not for testimony, but for closure. Judge Harrison commended Daniel publicly for his courage. "This court will remember that justice came because a child refused to remain silent," he said. The words resonated deeply. Walking out of the courthouse, Daniel squeezed Maya's hand. "It's really over now, isn't it?" She smiled. "Yes, Daniel, it's over." And so life went on. Summers were filled with trips to the park, ice cream cones dripping in the sun, afternoons at the community pool. Autumn brought school projects, soccer games, and piles of leaves they raked together in the yard, only to jump into them laughing. Birthdays became joyful occasions, not quiet acknowledgements as they once had been. Friends filled the house, laughter echoed through the rooms, and Daniel blew out candles with wishes he could now say aloud. Maya cherished each of these ordinary days. For so long Daniel's life had been stolen, piece by piece in silence. Now every ordinary moment was extraordinary. By the time Daniel turned 12, he had grown tall, his voice stronger, his confidence brighter. At Cedar Grove Academy, he became known not just as the boy who spoke after years of silence, but as a leader. He mentored younger students, helped those struggling in class, and even joined the debate team. His teachers often remarked that he had a gift, not just for words, but for listening. He gave others the space to speak, a trait born of the years when he had no choice but to listen himself. Maya often sat in the audience at his debates, her heart swelling. She thought back to the boy sitting on the cold floors of the estate, drugged and voiceless, and marveled at how far he had come. Years later, as the Haven Project expanded into multiple cities, Daniel's story continued to inspire. The center's motto was drawn from his words, "No one can silence the truth." It appeared on the walls, on pamphlets, on the shirts of volunteers. And though Daniel never sought fame, his legacy lived on through every child who found safety, every family who found justice, every truth that refused to be silenced. One quiet evening, years after the trial, Maya and Daniel sat on the porch of their home. The air was cool, the stars bright. Daniel was older now, his shoulders broader, his voice deeper. But when he spoke, Maya still heard the boy who had once whispered her name for the first time. "Do you think people will forget?" he asked softly. Maya shook her head. "They might forget the details, but they'll remember the truth, and they'll remember you had the courage to speak it." He smiled faintly, then leaned against her. For a long while they sat in silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. Because now, at last, Daniel Whitmore was free. Free to speak, free to laugh, free to live. And in the end, that freedom was the truest justice of all.